Hello and welcome to Captive Minds. My name is Max Perry, and I'm an independent journalist, and my work is currently syndicated in Covert Action Magazine. And with me is my co-host, Shaenah Batterson, and she's also our producer as well, I should mention. Hi, Shaenah.
Hi, Max. Good to be back and to have a guest.
Yes, we have another guest, and our special guest today is actually a very accomplished journalist and political scientist. His name is Aaron Good. Aaron, if you're not familiar, has a PhD in political science from Temple University, and he's also the author of a terrific book called American Exception, Empire, and the Deep State, which is available via Skyhorse Publishing. Aaron also hosts the podcast American Exception, which I was recently on as a guest. And he's interviewed I believe they've got over 200 episodes, and he's interviewed a very impressive list of commentators and public figures, including Christian Parenti, Scott Ritter, um, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and many, many more impressive guests. So, Aaron, it's really great to have you on the show. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I mentioned that you recently had Christian Parenti on your show a few months ago, and he wrote a great article for Compact Magazine about the origins of the term deep state, which your book gets into. And in that article, he talks about how the origins of the term deep state actually goes back to left-wing politics or Cold War politics, I should say, in Turkey. There was this revelations during both Operation Gladio and then also in the 1990s, there was a big scandal in Turkey where basically it was revealed that there was this parallel government or state within a state made up of various factions of secular Kemalists, in Turkish intelligence, in the military, the judiciary, and working directly with organized crime and ultranationalist, neo-fascist paramilitary groups like the Grey Wolves, who were also part of Gladio, and they basically had this mechanism in place to prevent the Turkish state from veering too far from its secularism towards, during the Cold War, it was communism. And then I guess later on, it's Islamism that they've mostly targeted along with the Kurds. But anyway, he wrote that article in response to how in more recent years during the Trump era, as we all know, the term deep state has become popularized and taken on a different association with the political right or the right wing in the United States. So I just wanted to ask you off the bat, what do you make of the way the whole concept of the deep state has become something stigmatized and now outright denied by like the liberal left or the fake left, when if you look at its historical origins, it really dates back to I mean, because you also done work with Peter Dale Scott, who, he sort of disseminated that whole idea into left-wing politics in the United States or in the West. And he wrote about, deep, he called it more deep politics. He has a great book, Deep Politics and
The death of JFK.
Death of JFK. Yeah. So I guess what do you make of, like, how did this all happen? How did
Yeah. So in the US, at the end of World War II, they make the decision to create a national security state to protect from the global communist conspiracy, which was something that they greatly exaggerated in its intentions and its overall power and the power distribution really between the US and the Soviets. The Soviet Union was pretty wrecked after World War II. They'd lost about 27 million people. The US didn't lose 500,000 people. They'd lost a huge amount of their industry and just had seen enormous swaths of the country destroyed. And Likewise, China, which goes communist in 1949, had lost 20 million people, maybe more in World War II also. And they were very far, far behind the US in terms of technological progress and industrial capacity and so on. So there really was no parity between the capitalist world led by the US and the Soviet and the communist world at all. And yet, in order to justify this sort of new project to put spread capitalism everywhere, because as Henry Luce of Life magazine said, freedom will require more living space than tyranny, meaning that like Lebensraum, right? It was a
Yeah, I
sort
was
of
just
saying
gonna
that
say that.
we, for this American century, this new American project that we're going to go for after the war for freedom, we may need even more land and we need freedom to be in more places than even tyranny would need because freedom needs more. So this was a strange formulation, but it was built on this idea that you're going to have an empire. So if you're going to have an empire, you need to, by definition, basically undermine the sovereignty of other countries at your whim. But the US needed to create a good facade for itself, a good cover story for this empire. So it wasn't an empire, it was really about freedom. And it wasn't about capitalism. That wasn't going to be emphasized. It was more like freedom and democracy, free enterprise, you could say, which is another euphemism for capitalism. But because they went on this crusade to create an American century, which is really a world dominated by American commercial interests, and maintained by American force of arms. But they had to pretend to be a good democracy. They needed to do things covertly. So they created the CIA and they began while they talked about decolonization, they really started overthrowing governments and really instituting a transition away from colonialism to neocolonialism. So it really wasn't decolonization, it was really a transition to neocolonialism. And they needed to overthrow governments sometimes if they were really nationalist or socialist, or if they were both socialist with nationalist aspirations as well, like in Iran, which was 1953. That's a famous one, the first
Mhm.
covert operation where they really overthrow a government, it would seem. And it was about oil, and the oil interests of Britain were aggrieved, but the people in the CIA understood that if Iran was allowed to be successful in this enterprise using their oil money to improve their own society rather than enrich Western multinationals, that this would be a really bad example. So the US got involved and overthrew this government, but they lied about it. And this began official lying on the part of the US on a scale that had not really happened before. And the covert apparatus becomes more and more powerful. It's debated in the 50s under Eisenhower, like what did we create here? There's this one report. I think it's the what is it? The one of the guys' names was Bruce Lovett report. That's what it was. One guy was named Bruce. One guy was named Lovett. And they're talking about the CIA in I think 1956 or so in ways that are basically talking about it as almost a state within a state, and that it's a real problem for democracy. The State Department itself can't function diplomatically because it doesn't even know what the U.S. is really doing in these countries. They're often in the dark. It's really this whole litany of complaints about it. But the U.S. public didn't know about any of this. They only start to see some cracks under JFK, but really not until after JFK were there more exposés on the CIA and on this new system that had arisen. And the guy, Arthur Schlesinger, who was in the OSS himself and was really a liberal anti-communist guy, not a person that I really admire very much, but he did understand that the CIA was a huge problem. And they finally declassified a report from him where he just says the CIA is taking on all the characteristics of a state within a state. So this is an American reference to a kind of deep state idea. And as more things get exposed in the 60s, because of Vietnam especially, but in the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination and eventually Watergate, you have a lot of different scandals and crimes that are exposed. And sometimes these are exposed by like one set of criminals leaking things or publicizing things written by other sets of people within this milieu. None of them really believe in democracy or justice or truth, but they're trying to win political fights against the other factions within this regime. So, for example, I think Ramparts might have, as bizarre as this sounds, Ramparts may have been like a Mossad operation.
You
In
know, we should talk about that at some point because I don't want to interrupt you, but too much. But coincidentally, I'm actually working on an article on David Horowitz right now, and his whole political history, and he was an editor at Ramparts, and I'm sort of investigating that. So I haven't found anything too conclusive, but it's interesting you mentioned that.
Yeah, I don't think that we will find any kind of rock solid confirmation of this. This is really a circumstantial case, but um, the fact that so many people there ended up being part of the neocon right. And then
Hmm.
some of them were probably, I think Horowitz and Sol Stern were plants from the beginning. And I think Hinkle
Wow.
took direction from somebody else. Hinkle, the next thing he did after he left Ramparts, now this is a little bit of a digression here, and I'll get back to the deep state thing. But
Yeah.
the next thing that Hinkle did after he left Ramparts was he started this magazine, maybe called
He
Scanlon's.
outed, didn't he wasn't he working with the guy that outed Daniel Ellsberg?
Well, that guy, Sidney Zion, yeah, I don't, Zion did have some role in the Pentagon Papers thing, which is weird, and
I
I
think he
can't.
disclosed his name. I think
Yeah,
he,
he did. He had some role in this, but which is probably important, but I'm not going to attempt to totally make sense of that. I knew Dan, and Dan is a very interesting guy, and he's best friends with Peter Dell Scott. So I could talk about those two for hours, but I don't want to get too sidetracked. What I do want to say about what Warren Hinkle did was he founded this magazine with Sidney Zion, who also was the guy who ghost wrote Roy Cohn's memoirs. So he's friendly with Roy Cohn. And I also just found out that he wrote an editorial for Harper's or an article for Harper's magazine arguing that Meyer Lansky should be allowed to stay in Israel because the Israel should keep him there because the right of return should protect him, which is exactly the kind of milieu that I was saying that Hinkle was kind of representing if he was working, if Ramparts really was designed to attack the
wasn't one
CIA.
of the
But
main Ramparts guys. I think it's Sol Stern. Wasn't he born in not
yes,
Israel,
he
but
was,
Mandatory Palestine?
yes, yes. And then so he wrote his first article was this article in the spring of 1967, which was a blockbuster. It's historically important. It's the one that exposes how the CIA was funding the Student Association and everything else.
Right.
And I believe that that was done as part of an effort to really wrong foot the CIA, which had a lot of Arabists and people who weren't sympathetic with aggressive Zionism, people who thought the US national interest was in befriending these oil-rich countries, sort of like what Trump is doing now. I mean, those same dynamics are still at play. The Middle East is full of oil-rich countries with a lot of Arabs where the oil is. And so it doesn't make sense to alienate them from a imperial logic point of view, right? So I'm not saying that the CIA are the good guys here, but there were elements of the CIA that were not part of this neocon project. That's why parts of the US establishment, enough of the US establishment resisted the 1956 land grab in the Suez Crisis, which was another Israeli Zionist land grab, essentially, with backing from France and Britain. But there was enough power in the U in the of the sort of traditional Arab, pro-Arab, oil-friendly, oil-dominated, Rockefeller-dominated CIA that they did not want to go along with what the Zionists had planned there. But in 1967, they are weaker, and they've just been exposed in the spring as funding all these student groups. And so I think that when Ramparts exposed this was really a way to damage the CIA on the eve of the Six-Day War, to have more pressure on these groups that would have potentially opposed what Israel did in the 67 war. It's just become clear to me more recently how fanatically they are devoted to this idea of greater Israel. And if you understand that, it makes sense of a lot of the crazy things they've done over the years. Like this is what they've always wanted. They've done everything to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state, and they want to have more land over there. Like they are lunatics, really. And I believe that part of the battles here within this deep political system, the way that these sort of oligarchic factions fight against each other, I believe that like these leaks are a part of it. And these stories that become publicized and scandals are often related to this. And so this is a good example of how the deep state is kind of pluralistic. It does have competing factions that fight each other or compete with each other and conflict with each other. And sometimes will assassinate or character assassinate people, blackmail them, everything that we've sort of become more aware of in the last few years with Epstein and so many other cases that just show that this is a pretty nasty system. So as and Americans gradually woke up to these things, especially in Watergate, which was another big conflict, which is complicated, but it was a kind of conflict over the regime in the U.S. and the changes to the global economy, the dollar system, détente, getting out of Vietnam, Nixon's efforts to change the national security state and to reform drug policy. These are all things that weighed in on Watergate. And so Watergate involves a whole lot of leaks and exposures that eventually give rise to Senate investigations and the House investigation, right? The Church Committee and the Pike Committee. And then there's the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which looks at the Kennedy assassination and the other ones of the 60s, the MLK and RFK, but they don't do as much on those. And then you have Reagan elected after eventually. So this, which is a big shift to the right. But the outcome of all of these battles, these sort of deep political events in the US that never really get explained, is that the US ends up with, starting with Reagan, an extremely right-wing, ultra-capitalist, corporate, militarist uh, regime that just is bent on global dominance above all else and crushes left-wing politics and even liberal reformist politics in the US. And so Americans in the 70s and 80s with Iran-Contra, when you had another set of scandals, they learned more and more about the dark side of the US. And this is where people start talking about a deep state. So you did have some of this in the 60s and 70s, people writing about the Kennedy assassination, people writing about the CIA working with drug traffickers in Southeast Asia. That happens in the early 70s. All of these exposés on Watergate and different nefarious covert action policies that they had. This happens a lot in the 70s, and there's a resurgence of it around Iran-Contra. And the next time there's a number of scandals that come out is in the early 90s, which I think again had something to do with Israel because it was around the time that George H.W. Bush was really putting a lot of pressure on Israel to negotiate a Palestinian state. And so I've come to believe that the role of Zionism in these conflicts is bigger than people have wanted to realize, and that's been one of the central issues is this issue of aggressive Zionism as in and whether U.S. foreign policy should be directed towards advancing that or whether it's not in the national interest. I think if you look at it now, you'd have to say that the the people who were able to steer the U.S. towards such a pro-Israel side had enough power and wealth and were ruthless enough to do it, but that it's been a disaster for U.S. interests. Like even if whether you're pro-empire or not, U.S. hegemony is on the decline, on its way out, it would seem. And these wars in the 21st century, all of which don't really make a lot of sense unless you think that they're for Israel, to a large extent at least. I mean, I know you have military contracts and there's the oil, but I don't see these as being totally logical to explain what they're doing there with that. I mean, I believe so. This has been a big issue propelling neoconservatism, and that's a part of our story. But the bigger issue of the way that the deep state gets created and conceptualized is perhaps more important because we have this system that is so bent towards criminal activity in terms of overthrowing governments and so on. And then there's also, goes even deeper beyond what Schlesinger or other people would have said. There's the institutionalized alliance with the National Crime Syndicate and whatever form that takes today. But the other part of the deep state that was very grim and super taboo to even discuss, was written about in Peter Dale Scott's book, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. And he points out that the drug traffic and the national crime syndicate wasn't really a bunch of Italian guys. Uh, it involved the Teamsters, and Meyer Lansky's role in it is very key and seems to have been largely suppressed by people. And so if you understand,
Well, Jewish organized crime doesn't get as much attention as the Italian mafia has, period, as far as like American folk.
mythology.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's this great article in 1997 written about, I think it's 97. It was in Vanity Fair, and it was about Sidney Korshak, who was this lawyer for the Las Vegas crowd, which is really Lansky's, you could call it Jewish mafia, Zionist mafia, Yiddish mafia, whatever you'd want to call it. But his role in as being the accountant and real money launderer of the crime syndicate is hugely important. And they used Teamster loans to build casinos and have other sources of capital. And I also believe because Las Vegas was established as a money laundering headquarters by Lansky to deal with the profits that were going to be coming in from a heroin connection he'd set up in Mexico with this guy named Harold Meltzer as the person running it down there. And that's really what Vegas was created for. It was created as a money laundering center for the drug trade, which is really wild to think about. And even today, when they wanted to kill Assange and spy on him illegally, they had an old Lansky outfit handle it, Sands Casino, which is owned by Adelson, the Adelson family. But that's who the CIA, instead of using Robert Mayhew and Johnny Rosselli, Murder Incorporated or whatever, when they tried to get rid of Castro, they just use another Vegas Zionist mobster figure, essentially, Adelson, and his Sands Casino, which was a Lansky enterprise early on back in Vegas, but now they make like billions and billions in East Asia, in Macau, and you wonder if China's going to ever shut that down. But I mean, it's still with us today. So this aspect of the U.S. not being really lawful, really functioning as a lawless kind of inner empire, but doing things covertly and then just denying a lot of its most spectacular crimes. This is really the essence of the deep state. And Peter Dale Scott, I think, conceptualized this very well before the Turkey Susurluk incident. His 1993 book really describes the basics of this very well. And then in the early 2000s, Ola Tanander did great work. He has this excellent essay. I think maybe it's Approaching the Deep State of the West, something like that. I can't remember the name of it, but he's also a friend of Peter's and mine. He's a Swedish academic. So there've been a small number of people working in these areas, which is a shame because I actually think it's it's perhaps the most important political science, social science, political, historical issue that we have to deal with, because we don't even really understand as a society what kind of regime we live under. And that is a real problem for any kind of conception of how you might democratically change things.
Yeah, that's all really interesting. I'd like to ask you, do you think that the whole concept of the deep state has been co-opted by things like QAnon? Because I think that QAnon has some sort of intelligence ties, and I feel like the term has been stigmatized and delegitimized by things like that. Could you talk about that?
Yes, I believe that that's likely on purpose. One of the earlier sources I mean, you have Alex Jones, who seems like a plant of some kind. And
He has military intelligence connections in his family, I'm pretty sure.
yeah, I mean, I could believe that, and I mean, even the way these things are set up, where he has sponsors who are using him to sell prepper, products and stuff like that. You have to wonder, that'd be an easy way to funnel money to somebody, is just have them have sponsors for this, that. I don't even really know. And I'm not even going to try to like make a grand indictment of him individually, because it's not that important. But he had on his show this guy named Steve Pashenik, who previously had been like a psychological operations person, and he wrote a book called "We Killed Aldo Moro." And it was written up in the UK Independent, like a discuss, or I don't know if it was a review or just a preview of the book, but the book never got released. It never came out. But he talked about his role in basically orchestrating the death of Aldo Moro, who was an Italian politician who wanted to compromise with the communists and to include them in a left-wing coalition government. And the US told him, you better not do that. Henry Kissinger, according to Aldo Moro's wife, Henry Kissinger said, if you proceed with this, you'll be killed by some, sort of marginal elements. And that's basically what happened. So this guy, Pashenik, was there sort of talking about QAnon before QAnon. He was saying that, oh, yeah, there's these secret actors within the government and they're working to take on the deep state and they're going to expose 9/11 and expose these other things. And it was all very weird. And then
Hey,
shortly
don't forget the part
afterwards,
about how JFK Jr. is still alive and he's going to come back and
yeah, yeah, that comes out later with the different QAnon stuff. And so QAnon does seem like a right-wing conspiracism sort of a thing. And there's other figures like Anthony Sutton that are like this, people that have come along, and I think that they're sort of disinformation operatives. And what really the goal is, I believe, because it's so obvious that things have declined and that society is going to shit in so many ways that whether you're conservative or you're leftist or liberal, you know that, and you kind of manage the conservatives to give them somebody to blame. And that was the Nazis did this famously with Jews. And but there are different people today who are like, no, it's not this imperial capitalism, it's not oligarchy, it's this group of conspirators that if we stopped them, everything would be fine. But it's not, and it's typically a made up group or something. It's whether it's the Illuminati or it's just Jews writ large
Lizard
or
people.
lizard people. Yeah, the woke people. All right, like
yeah.
this is a way to like have these sort of endless kind of distractions about, like the Davos. Even the Davos thing is the weirdest one of all. The right-wing people are like so against the Davos set, which the Davos set is not good, but it's like they think of them as not just capitalists. They think of them as like
They
somehow
think
these
they're
boogeymen.
Marxists, which is completely absurd.
Yeah, that's the cultural Marxism thing is another one, which is the most absurd, for somebody like me who is saying like, hey, materialism is what we should pay attention to. This all this cultural stuff is like designed to just keep us, gazing into our navels and arguing with each other and scolding each other forever. And so there's never any solidarity. And then they're trying to say like, oh, cultural Marxism is the problem. Like they're dupes even more. They're even bigger dupes than the people who are so aggressively like, woke crusaders.
um, I wanted to ask you, Peter Dale Scott, who we've talked about, and then also Michael Parenti, Christian Parenti's father, who wrote about the Kennedy assassination in his essay JFK and the Gangster State. I remember they had some pretty famous spats with people on the left, like Noam Chomsky and the late Alex Coburn, who used to edit Counterpunch newsletter. Because the two of them, the latter two, Chomsky and Coburn, they, smugly mocked, JFK assassination conspiracy theories. And you've done a lot of work on the Kennedy assassination, and specifically, you've done a lot of work on Israel's possible role in it, including in relation to, JFK's stance on Israel's clandestine nuclear program. And I've noticed that even within the realm of, like JFK assassination aficionados who've delved into like other aspects of the conspiracy around his murder. Even like the Oliver Stone film JFK, which like really popularized a lot of it. It mostly focuses on like the Cuban expat, organized crime, CIA aspect, not Mossad or Israel. And I've even seen people like Sam Husseini, who you've also interviewed on your show, criticize Oliver Stone for that. Do you feel like this sort of aversion to looking at the Israeli angle is like part of this aversion to like conspiracies on the left now, not just about like the deep state, but like the fear of being labeled anti-Semitic for going there? Because it seems like I've been into JFK, the whole JFK thing for years. I've read many, many books, but like the Israel angle, I'll admit, is like the aspect that I probably know the least about. So, and I've mostly because when I have seen it, a lot of it has come from, quote unquote, anti-Semitic very
Yeah.
right figures.
Well, yeah, very
I'm
obvious, kind of
refreshing to
flamboyantly anti-Semitic.
Yeah, for sure. But it's refreshing to see someone on the left like yourself really looking closely at it. So do you feel like that's sort of where, like, why is that such a radioactive like angle? And do you feel like it's a much more important component to the whole JFK conspiracy than just the, right-wing Cuban emigres and all that?
Yeah, I believe that it's important to understand what actually happened with the assassination, and it impacts the aftermath of the assassination. I do not believe it's a matter of like Israel assassinated JFK. And I don't fault Oliver for not including anything on Israel in this, because there really was very little that he wouldn't have been able to. There wasn't good literature on it at that point. Really, before Peter wrote Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, and Peter doesn't even try to make an Israel case in that, is the amazing thing. Peter has been so cautious about making any sort of statements about that. He mostly just puts these facts in the book. And the first time that I read it, a lot of it did not register with me. I didn't really clock a lot of it because when I first read Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, which was probably 2009 or 2010, I was really new to this, and there was so much information in it that I couldn't quite, make sense of all of it. But what he puts in that book is that the crime syndicate of, these Italian guys, which Hoover and the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Harry Anslinger, only grudgingly kind of started to admit in the 1950s after there were these hearings in front of Congress about organized crime, and there were different scandals involving the Teamsters and so on. Finally, Hoover admits, like, okay, there's this thing, but it's the Italian mafia or La Cosa Nostra, whatever you want to call it. Okay, and that was where it stood. But in reality, it really wasn't an Italian thing. It was, as Peter lays out in the book, it's multi-ethnic, and a big part of it is centered around Lansky and the Las Vegas mob and the Teamsters. And so Ruby is tied into all of these people, Jack Ruby, and he's a very key figure because he was described as a syndicate lieutenant by a guy who was his lawyer during the Kefauver hearings. And according to this lawyer, Ruby gave them information about Chicago mobsters and the condition was that they would give Dallas a clean bill of health, which is where he was at the time, in Dallas, right? So Jack Ruby was involved in these events. He was involved in two key events related to the syndicate takeover of important parts of the U.S. The first one was the murder of a union official who was a junk handlers union president, and then Jack Ruby was like the secretary. And Ruby was in the room when this guy gets murdered in 1939. And the outcome of that is that the union gets taken over by this guy named Alan Dorfman, who becomes Jimmy Hoffa's right-hand man, and he is the pivotal figure in allowing mob control of the Teamster pension funds. And Robert Kennedy even wrote about this murder in his book, The Enemy Within, in 1960, whenever it came out. Right. So Jack Ruby was a part of that. And then also lifetime associates of Ruby, or people that he'd known since he was very young and that he had connections with as an adult, were behind the murder of James Reagan, who was the person who controlled the National Racing Wire Service. So once he's killed, there's this new monopoly, and it's by people that are friendly to Lansky and the syndicate over the National Racing Wire, which is essentially like the kind of internet in a way of the day, where that handled the gambling. You knew what the racing results were and so on. So it was really useful for organized crime, gambling interests all around the US. And it was a way to corrupt law enforcement, because you get them taking bribes, and this and that, then you have them for everything. And so the syndicate had these Teamster funds, and it had control of of gambling in the US, and it had this Las Vegas Center for Money Laundering and so on, and gambling as well. So this was and Jack Ruby was tied to like all of these forces, and
Well, his
Lansky
real
was
name
really
was
at the top of it.
Rubenstein, right? Wasn't his real name Rubenstein?
Rubenstein, yeah, he was part of what you could call like the Yiddish mafia in his youth. And he was in gangs that like beat up people for anti-Semitism, like in different ways to like just he was in, which is he has an interesting background. And when you look at the stories of these, even people like Lansky, if you look at it in kind of a detached way, you can say like, well, you see why they would have this kind of mentality of like, we better create a powerful organization to kill people because, we've been bullied and persecuted and so on. But it ends up taking this really ghastly kind of form in the U.S. and rising to huge dimensions. But Lansky is works with the government in World War II. Harry Truman gives him the Medal of Honor in 1945. 1948, Harry Truman wins in part because of a huge campaign bribe from Zionist actors, and he recognizes the state of Israel. And Meyer Lansky and Jimmy Hoffa are sending the arms over to Israel to allow them to take over, to kill the Palestinians and steal all their land and such. Like this is a mobbed up enterprise. I mean, it's the other mobsters too, like Mickey Cohen were doing this. It's this, and it's protected. Lansky was protected, and his drug trafficking was protected. He was never wiretapped or anything by the FBI. He basically had protection from J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and the chief of CIA counterintelligence, James Angleton, who also handled the Israeli account, which, the Mossad liaison. And so to get back to JFK, the film and so on in the early 90s, the more interesting information about the Israeli role wasn't really known until recently. For one thing, Jeff Morley discovered that this guy, Reuben Efron, who worked for Angleton, but he was from Eastern Europe, and was Jewish, and was brought to Angleton not through CIA channels, but probably through Mossad, I would guess. But he's the person that's assigned to read Lee Harvey Oswald's mail for a long time. And then after the assassination, Efron is in the room when they're interrogating and interviewing Marina Oswald, about her story, which they're going to use to try to nail Oswald. And he later goes to Israel at the sort of the end of his life, and he writes these articles for an American Zionist Council. I believe that's what it is, or maybe World Zionist Council, but these magazines they put out, and his articles were on like the long storied tradition of great Jewish spies. So I would think he seems to be part of this Israeli component that Angleton had. But the other interesting issue is that when Angleton was running, and this is something that I discovered myself, that when Angleton was running the Cuban operations, involving assassination plots and subterfuge and sabotage with William Harvey, another kind of crazy CIA officer at the time. Angleton used the excuse that, well, the CIA is so penetrated with Soviet moles that I can't use the CIA to manage this. I need to have a Mossad person secretly running all the operations in Cuba and then reporting to me. So you had a Mossad person instead of anyone in the CIA who was aware of all of the gangster business with the mob and assassination units and everything in Cuba, and the whole CIA wasn't aware of it. And I found a page that had been deleted later in Angleton's testimony to the church committee, where Angleton admits that he never told the CIA director about this. The CIA director didn't know. And that to me was a kind of a bombshell, because not only did Angleton not inform the CIA director, that John McCone, that this very sensitive position was being held by a foreign intelligence officer, but it was recognized as being important enough that they needed to remove it from the document itself. It's just they didn't remove it in an earlier version because it was so redacted that the page didn't make any sense, and so I was able to find it. So I think that there are operational things that we know now about how things happened in the Kennedy assassination that involve Israel that we didn't know before. But I don't really I don't believe that it was purely an Israeli operation because they wouldn't have had, you had to have the military involved, I believe, in some way. And you had to know the FBI wasn't going to, mess this up. You had to know that it would succeed. And so I believe that it was likely the Joint Chiefs, the crazy militarist fanatics in the Pentagon, and different oligarchs in the US. And then the way that they got around the fact that Kennedy, controlled the government was they used a lot of syndicate resources. So that would seem to make sense with the way that it unfolded. But the kicker is, I believe that Israel has subsequently blackmailed the U.S. over this, over its knowledge of the JFK assassination, and that is why I believe they helped finance Oliver Stone's movie in the late '80s
Yeah, because
when,
Arnon Milchan produced that film,
yes,
and I've written about him before in regards to um, with the whole nuclear technology and all that. I've written about him before, but yeah, I always thought it was very curious as to why he would produce a film like that, but I guess that sort of explains it.
because
Um,
it was in the late '80s and it came out in like 1990, right? But this was at the time when Reagan, one of the last things Reagan did was, as president, I believe it was after he lost the election, or no, after his term had ended, or after George H.W. Bush had already won, Reagan recognized the PLO because Israel had always been saying, and the U.S. had been saying, well, they're terrorists, we can't negotiate with them. And then the PLO was saying, we renounce terrorism. And finally, the Reagan wants to recognize them because Reagan recognizes that the Israeli and people around Reagan recognize that the Israeli power in the U.S. and his influence over foreign policy over this issue of Palestine was detrimental. And so H.W. Bush goes even further and he withholds loan guarantees to force Israel to negotiate with Palestine. And I believe that that's why in around this time you would have had them looking to expose scandals in the U.S. And U.S. crimes of this kind of magnitude because other things happen around this time too. You don't just have the JFK film which really puts the CIA on the defensive and the U.S. establishment on the defensive. You also had BCCI exposed in the early '90s, and the
mhm.
main person behind exposing that was a guy named Morgenthau. I think he was the Attorney General of New York, but or maybe he was a attorney for the U.S. government or the Justice Department, one or the other. But either way, the guy it was Morgenthau in New York who was the main person really pushing the exposure of BCCI and his family, his father was one of the main people behind um, getting the Israeli nuclear program established. He's this establishment guy who was in FDR's cabinet even. So I think that and there was a BBC documentary on Gladio that was pretty amazing
Yeah,
at
I've
this
seen
time that
that.
came out. There was the Danny Cosolero octopus stuff. There were investigations of the October surprise going on in Congress. Even Iran-Contra itself seems to be potentially related to this. Like around the time 80, 86, 87, 88, and in the early 90s, you had a lot of things coming out about what the US had been doing, and it just so happened to coincide with the last real push to try to establish a Palestinian state. And what I think happened was that Israel, with its intimate knowledge of U.S. crimes, high crimes, that they can basically leak and expose these things to terrify the U.S. establishment and bring them to bend to their will. I think that that's part of what's happened. I think they even have insisted on taking over aspects like sexual blackmail. Like I think that's why you have somebody like Epstein doing that. I think that probably Mossad has arranged to tell the US we're going to handle these things like assassinations and sexual blackmail that and you have to let us be in charge of this, and that gives them enormous power over the U.S. So you have things like Dennis Hastert, as this
Pedophile.
disgusting pedophile in Congress for years and years, and he's the Speaker of the House, and he's taking heroin money, $200,000 from Turkish heroin suppliers, right? Like, how can this possibly happen? But I think it's this institutionalized clandestine apparatus that is has basically made the crime syndicate, which is probably more international now, a part of our governing regime. It's really amazing when you stop to think about it, but it's when you understand capitalism and how making money is above all like the highest priority, then it's like, okay, well, yeah, I guess it would make sense.
Um, I know the Israeli angle is also believed to be related, and you were kind of alluding to this earlier, to RFK's assassination as well. And I've seen other journalists like Lisa Pease and some other people do work on how Sirhan was likely framed and was even probably part of like a MK Ultra related plot, which is what a lot of investigators obviously believe about most of those lone gunman assassinations of the period. Um, but I know I wanted to ask you because I know you've had you did have RFK Jr. a while back on your show. Um, if you don't mind my asking, I mean, are you disappointed at all with his jumping on the Trump train and his sort of stances on Israel? Because I myself was, I liked him for a long time. I remember like during the Syrian war, he took out a great article about, I think it was called like Syria, another pipeline war, and he seemed to be very on the ball.
Yeah, but
Um,
now that you think about that and you look at that Syrian article, I mean, I now see that as more of a neocon project to make the Middle East safe for Israel. So when RFK is writing about that as a pipeline war, I think like he's not writing about it as a war for, those ultra Zionist neoconservatives. I believe that RFK is blackmailed by Israel and I think he's essentially tried to admit this in a roundabout way because two of his friends, Charles Eisenstein, and I don't remember who the other guy is, but I think he's famous. Other people would know him who are more tuned into these high profile figures than me. But they did this YouTube video that was said, "Is RFK being blackmailed by Israel?" or something like that. And I halfway watched it, sort of halfway paying attention because it was, I don't know, for whatever reason, I wasn't totally absorbed by it. But as I recall, they were saying like, yeah, he is, and this is kind of how it works, and so on. So I took that as an admission by RFK to sort of try to tell people without telling them, because these people are friends with RFK. Like they wouldn't, I don't think that they would be out there. They're close friends to him. I know this. And I don't think they would be saying these things if it weren't true. I believe what happened with RFK is I don't think that you could get someone to run for president because you have sexual blackmail dirt on them. I think that that would be a not good intelligence craft, let's just say. You could get people to not to do certain things or to do this or do that, but full on running for president purely because you're being sexually blackmailed, I think that would be difficult. I think what RFK in his own mind rationalizes this as the only way that he can get anywhere close to power or have a position of power to try to like confront this sort of big pharma behemoth that is poisoning Americans as he sees it is to get into power. And since Israel has all this blackmail on him and he can't stop them, he just goes with that and he takes all these absurd positions on Israel that contradict everything he says about peace and what America should be. And so it makes it, if you were a supporter of his, it was very ridiculous and painful. I worked with him and David Talbot and I worked on his campaign of the super PAC. And we did everything we could to try to move him on Israel. And there's some bizarre anecdotes that I don't know that I can get into here, but basically it wasn't going to happen. Even though he kind of liked Jeffrey Sachs's ideas on Israel, he was vetoed by other people around him who said, no, it's unacceptable, which was basically to have the U.S. Not vote against recognizing a Palestinian state in the Security Council. That's what Jeffrey Sachs has proposed. RFK actually liked that idea, but then it was vetoed by people around him. So it's a really sad thing to watch. I hope that he is able to somehow do some good things in his position there. I don't, I'm not an expert on pharmacology, but I find this sort of liberal leftist, the defense of pharma and the like
Mhm.
rejection of any possibility that these regulatory agencies could be like terribly corrupt and that this $1 trillion vaccine industry could actually be kind of scandalous and detrimental to public health, like the way that that's become kind of a culture war issue of like, oh, you're like a MAGA person because you don't trust Pfizer and the federal, regulatory agencies. It's very strange to me. It's like a magical, it's like they forgot everything they're supposed to know about capitalism and corporate greed, and then they turn into Rachel Maddow. I don't really understand that. It's probably not good for me to say that from like a branding perspective for me, but I've never really tried to approach things that way. I think it's very strange that they act this way. Things like peanut allergies, for example, those seem to be logically a result of vaccine injuries. Best I can tell, because they produce an immune response, and that immune response could react to things in the environment like peanut and particles or something, and then you'd have a lifelong peanut allergy. That seems like it's likely a logical explanation for why there's so many of these in the US, but not in other countries. And historically, it wasn't the case, decades and decades ago. It was like, but then the orthodox position is, well, you can't say that. That's you're RFK, Trump, or anti-vax or whatever. So I just hope that he can actually succeed in getting some good science that is not clouded by conflicts of interest, and then we can actually have an informed debate on the pros and cons of these things. And I think he thinks that that's a way to do some good in a very corrupt world. But to have to prostrate yourself and kowtow to people committing genocide, is so sordid. And then when you consider the fact that his father was killed using a Palestinian patsy and that that couldn't have been an accident, I mean, it's really a horrible thing to watch.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your answering so candidly. I wasn't even sure that I should go there, but I appreciate your answer because I know like you'd interviewed him and it must have been very disappointing, but I agree completely. I do hope that something good comes out of, at least, talking about getting rid of all this terrible stuff that's in the poison that's in our food and
Yeah.
but obviously like the whole him being on Epstein's plane thing, I think you know, there's something there with that. I don't know what they have on him or I mean, and
It
even
could,
like
or it
these
could be
like
something else
culty
not
Catholics
Epstein
too.
related. It could be not Epstein. It could be not Epstein related, and he just knew Epstein because Epstein made it his business to know every sort of rich, prominent person. Or it could be Epstein related. I mean, who knows? But he has issues, addiction issues, sex addiction
Right.
issues. I feel a bit sorry for him because having studied the Kennedy assassination so much, I know the guy has money, and so it's easy enough to say that money solves all problems, especially if you don't have enough money. But I don't, I think no one who hasn't been through something like that could understand the impact it would have on him. And his father and uncle were like the centers of his world, I would think, and the whole family's world. And the way they were killed was so vicious. And so I see him as kind of a damaged person in that
Yeah.
way, which probably is why he's had these addiction issues, which probably makes him very vulnerable to blackmail, which explains why he goes around saying so many nice things about Israel.
Yeah, I really like the points you're making about the liberal left and not applying an analysis of capitalism to pharma because it's medicine for profit. So it wants to make you sicker. But anyhow, do you think you could talk a little bit just about the significance, the historical significance of Epstein within the US political establishment?
Well, I think that he was a figure who seems to have inherited a lot of the functions of people like Roy Cohn and Meyer Lansky in the past that relied on sexual blackmail of politicians to strengthen their hold on power. Um, it's interesting that it gets talked about the way it does now. I saw an episode of Piers Morgan's YouTube show where he had Scott Horton of antiwar.com
Hmm.
and John Kiriakou and then Alan Dershowitz and a Mossad guy. But they were debating, was Epstein, the title was Epstein an Israeli agent? And so it's interesting that people were talking about that and that Dershowitz and this Mossad agent also come off looking so ridiculous and not credible at all in the argument. So it's like there's more, you'll hear people more commonly say, yeah, Epstein was Israeli if you're listening to alternative media. I don't know how widely this is recognized outside of, radical political independent media sort of stuff. But that part is fascinating. And he worked with I've never been a person who could quote chapter and verse on the details of Epstein's life and so on. That's kind of a small bore focus thing that I kind of got the gist of it pretty well early on, and so I never really needed to know all the details, and they're pretty horrible. But the fact that he used this money from Les Wexner, who was part of that mega group of like super Zionists that emerged in the 90s and had a sort of strange role in influencing US politics at the time. And also the fact that his partner was Ghislaine Maxwell, whose father was Robert Maxwell, who was a Israeli spy. It all is pretty obvious that that's what was going on. So when you say Epstein belonged to intelligence, and then you look at the people around his network, yes, it's intelligence, and probably the Israeli, the Mossad CIA liaison or account or whatever is probably really what we're talking about here. That he handled the sexual blackmail that the U.S. deep state, national security state would have needed to have handled.
You've focused a lot on the organized crime angle with the Kennedy assassination. Um, what about the one thing I wanted to ask you about just off the cuff, like, is it true that Kennedy's father was involved in bootlegging during Prohibition, and did that factor at all into the Kennedy assassination as far as like the role of organized crime? Because I know that that's heavily disputed, right? That whether he was even involved in, but I know he
People
sold his
argue
liquor
about it.
business. Is that
Yeah.
where the whole family fortune comes from?
My understanding is that more of the wealth came from film distribution and then insider trading on the stock market. But I don't really know about the bootlegging details that much. Jim D'Eugenio has written a piece arguing against that. And I think it's quite likely that the sources of him being a great bootlegger would be difficult to nail down because you're talking about organized crime. So it's basically going to be hearsay and so on. He was never prosecuted for it. So you're going to be relying on hearsay. But he also would have had to, being in film distribution and so on, he would have had to have a modus vivendi, I think, with some elements of organized crime and the Teamsters and so on. The Teamsters were so powerful that when RFK was the attorney general and he wanted to get The Enemy Within, his book on labor racketeering and the syndicate, when he wanted to get that made into a movie and he had Paul Newman on board to star in it, um, the Teamsters intervened and no Hollywood studio would touch it, even though the attorney general, who's the president's brother, and Paul Newman were trying to make it happen. The Teamsters were more powerful. So that gives you a sense of the kind of corruption we're talking about. And it has to be said that the only time the government really went after organized crime was in the Kennedy years. And they were going after not various Italian guys, but they were wanting to go after the Teamsters and Las Vegas. And at one point, Robert Kennedy, he tasks a CIA officer named John Whitten with investigating these Panamanian banks that he thinks are the recipients of the skim that Lansky is taking from Las Vegas casinos. And this CIA officer, John Whitten, has to debrief or consult James Angleton, who runs the Israeli account, right, for the CIA. he has to consult him about looking into these bank records, and Angleton says, "No, you can't do that. That's the FBI's territory. We're not supposed to do that." And so Angleton then asks, or sorry, John Whitten, the guy that RFK had tasked with investigating this, goes to another CIA officer and says, "Why is Angleton doing this?" And then J.C. King, the other CIA officer, tells him, "Well, Angleton has these mob connections. It's connected to Cuba, Cuban business, and he doesn't want to jeopardize them." So you had the CIA, an official in the CIA, the chief of counterintelligence, essentially countermanding the all orders of the Attorney General of the United States, and not even, and he probably didn't even have it explained to him why this was happening. RFK didn't, but that's what they were up against. So I believe that his father knew enough about the crime syndicate to have informed his sons about some of these things. And I think that they actually wanted to reform it. They were going right after the tops of they wanted to go to do things, for example, instead of just arresting drug dealers and users, they wanted to go after these wholesale networks. They wanted to take the drug enforcement policy away from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which was very corrupt, and move it over to the Justice Department. So they were going after the pinnacle of organized crime like nobody else was. And when JFK is assassinated, once he's assassinated, RFK makes the observation that everybody that Jack Ruby had been calling in the weeks before the assassination were people that he'd investigated on the Rackets Committee. And RFK, after the assassination of JFK, never again meets with his organized crime department again, because I think he realizes that the gangsters won, and he gives up at that point. And LBJ really cracks down on wiretapping of mobsters because powerful lawyers and so on are complaining that, oh, these are Gestapo tactics that they're using here, wiretapping people and so on. And this was written up in newspapers and it allows Johnson to say, like, oh, we can't have this bad press of, us acting like the Gestapo, stop wiretapping people. And the result is that the mob is really allowed to go on its merry way. So the Kennedy relationship to the mob is complicated. Joe Kennedy may well have been a bootlegger. And you could also say maybe the Kennedys were trying to get rid of that Teamster influence in the Democratic Party so that they would have more power. Their wing of sort of liberal Northeastern reformers, reformist liberals would have more power. You could say it was for sort of selfish reasons if you want to look at it that way. But either way, the Democratic Party was extremely mobbed up. And that was kind of the source of their power. Once you got out of the Northeastern liberals like the Kennedys, you really had these Southern Democrats. They're often tied to the Teamsters, and they're kind of pretty corrupt in general. And that was the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party had people like Lansky and the Teamsters on their side, and the Republicans had Rockefellers and all of these other oligarchs. Increasingly, that's kind of what looks like to be the top of the power structure of both parties, is these capitalist gangsters and then these gangsters.
You mentioned Jack Ruby a couple of times now. Could you tell us a bit about the whole connection with Jack Ruby and Dr. Jolyon West in regards to MK Ultra?
Yes, my friend and collaborator Max Arvo did a whole lot of research on this, building
By the
on
way,
the.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Long story. He contacted me after I was on your podcast. He
Yeah,
and I had worked together years ago. So small world. But anyway,
yeah,
go
he told me about that. He told me about that too. I meant to mention that earlier, but then just sort of forgot. But I thought that was really funny and
crazy.
pretty cool. Yeah. And so he wrote these great stories on Jack Ruby after going and visiting the University of Austin and I think the UCLA campus, and looking at the papers of Jolyon West, who was an MK Ultra psychiatrist, notorious for dosing people with acid and doing all these other sinister things. And there was another guy named, I think, Hubert Winston Smith, who was in that milieu. And what we find is that around Ruby, his whole legal team was involved in MK Ultra adjacent projects and working with a lot of the same officials, officers, and psychiatrists that the CIA and OSS had used to do all these mind control experiments. And they looked to have ways to sort of integrate psychological warfare, brain warfare, with legal warfare, so lawfare. And so one of the things that these lawyers were interested in writing papers on was like, how could you use insanity defenses to get people off for crimes, right? Because they have Ruby in jail and they can't really have Ruby talk, and they need to have some way to like try to pretend to get him out maybe. And so they go with these insanity defenses. But in reality, what that does is it helps to discredit him. You know, he is considered he's saying he's crazy himself. He's using it as a defense. So already you are not able to um, say that he's a totally reliable actor. And eventually he needs to testify to the Warren Commission, and he's looking to get a second trial or a new trial. And Jolyon West comes to visit him, and right on that day is when Ruby has a psychotic break, and he's hallucinating and saying crazy things, and he injures himself, and it corresponds very well to like an acid trip. I mean, it seems like he was probably dosed with acid. I think that's a logical inference. And Jolyon West declares that he's had a psychotic break and that he's insane. And then a few days later, if I recall correctly, that's when he has that interview with Justice Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who's doing the investigation into the Kennedy assassination. And even still, Jack Ruby says, I'm in danger here. There's so much more to say about this, but I'm in danger. They're going to kill me. Can you take me to Washington and protect me? And I'll tell you what I know, because there's this new government that's taking shape here because of this, and it's a real disaster. And I'm not going to be around to see what happens, but it's horrible. And he was making all these strange statements, but um, at the time it could be attributed to, oh, he's gone crazy. And he was saying that, oh, my lawyers are working against me. They're the enemy. And so they were saying, well, he's paranoid. He must be paranoid. That just shows how crazy he is. But in reality, Jolyon West and Hubert Winston Smith and other people around the MK Ultra program and related CIA programs, they were involved in Ruby's case and his legal defense much earlier and much more consistently than people recognized. So the whole issue of Jack Ruby and the way that they solve it is, first of all, they try all these insanity defenses first, then they dose him with LSD so they can try to make him insane and use that as an argument. And then eventually he just dies of very fast acting cancer, which I would guess also came from the MK Ultra, bag of
Yeah.
tricks. But it's a really horrifying case to look at what they did to this guy, because he had to deal with the problem of Lee Harvey Oswald talking, and they dealt with it by killing Oswald. But then they had this Ruby problem to get rid of, which they tried to deal with by having him plead insanity, and then by dosing him with LSD apparently, and then ultimately killing him, it would seem. So he's a pivotal figure. He traces back to the Chicago outfit, and then he worked in Los Angeles at John Rosselli's Santa Anita racetrack. Johnny Rosselli is the guy who the CIA went to ask to have these mob plots against Fidel Castro, these assassination plots. In the 70s, Rosselli is going to testify to Congress, to the church committee, but instead he disappears and they find him chopped up in a barrel, floating off the coast of Miami. And these are people that Ruby was in that milieu, that sort of Las Vegas mob, Lansky mob. He visited Cuba, visiting Lansky associates like Louis McWillie, probably Santo Trafficante. He likely visited him in a Cuban prison. He was not a small time person, and he was not a pretender trying to act like he was more important. He probably was the syndicate lieutenant in Dallas, and his job was to control the fix with the local law enforcement authorities. I think Peter Dale Scott makes a very strong case for that being what the case was, and that he gets tasked with this Dallas operation, probably an offer he couldn't refuse. So he likely was involved with the assassination itself, and he's there stalking Oswald afterwards. So the day after, either Friday or Saturday, which is Saturday was the day after the assassination, he's there in a press conference with the district attorney Henry Wade, and Henry Wade says, "Yeah, Oswald was part of the Free Cuba Committee." And somebody in the back of the crowd shouts and says, "No, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee." And that person was Jack Ruby himself, correcting the district attorney about the finer points of Lee Harvey Oswald's biography, and he's wearing a yarmulke because he's pretending to be a translator for Yiddish journalists. Uh, and he's also carrying it's he admits later that he had a gun on him at the time. So he was really stalking Oswald. He was looking to get a chance to kill Oswald probably before even that the
And
moment that
in
he does kill
reality,
him.
Oswald was doing, I mean, that's the whole thing was that the dead giveaway that he was clearly an asset was because he was doing work in anti-Castro and then pro-Castro groups, and it was clearly not any kind of authentic communist. I mean, you'd have to be completely brain dead to believe that, obviously, but
He was distributed. He left his wife in Dallas, who had a kid and was pregnant with another, as I recall, to go to New Orleans for a while to do things like political organizing. Except he for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. That's one of the things he does, and he distributes these pamphlets with another volunteer, supposedly. But the other volunteer, well, he actually hires some people to do this for a day or something, which is weird. But he also has, as a listed member of the New Orleans chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, it's him and Alec Hidell. But Alec Hidell is just an alias that he used. So there was really only Oswald. And all that he did there was get arrested for having scuffles with pro-Castro or pro-US, anti-Castro Cubans. And then he goes on this radio show and he sort of discredits himself by admitting that he had defected to the Soviet Union, and he discredits the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And the kicker is that while he was distributing all of these Fair Play for Cuba pamphlets, he was doing this working out of an office owned by an ex-FBI super hard right winger who essentially had a huge file cabinet, archive of documents on communist subversives and so on. Um, and was the head of the like the Latin American Anti-Communist League, something like that. Like he was one of those the Caribbean Anti-Communist League, I believe is what it was. And he was also part of the right-wing Minutemen. I mean, he was a fascist essentially who was there to surveil and undermine communists. It's the last place where if you were looking to distribute literature sympathetic
yeah.
to Castro that you would work. It's ridiculous. I mean, he was obviously an agent provocateur. It's the only explanation that makes any sense, just in terms of his going to New Orleans in the first place, leaving his wife behind, but then, the office that he's working out of. It's pretty obvious that he defected to the Soviet Union as part of some counterintelligence operation. And then when he came back, his actions really make no sense at all unless he's acting as an intelligence operative.
Yeah, and we even know his handler was clearly Ruth Payne. I mean, that's pretty obvious. I saw that
Yeah.
documentary. Well, we've got to wrap up pretty soon. My last question really pertains actually to the JFK files that were recently released by the Trump administration. I mean, I don't know what if there is a big takeaway from those. I mean, we talked about on an earlier podcast about the revelations about the CIA's likely involvement in the 1956 uprising in Hungary was one of the big revelations in there. But is there anything that you think people should know about, or is this just is it not as big as they're making it out to be as far as this recent trove, or are they still withholding the whole full story?
I think that it will take a while for different researchers to find the more explosive and interesting things that are new that we didn't know before. The people that I would recommend that viewers can follow to have a good rundown on what's in these documents and what has been exposed are Jim DiEugenio and Jefferson Morley. Okay, Jefferson Morley really focuses a lot on the day-to-day, new developments in the case, and then Jim kind of goes deeper on various issues around it. They're going back in front of Congress soon as well, and there's going to be a witness to some of the cover-up aspects who hasn't been heard from before, as I understand it. I don't know too many details about that, but that's fascinating. So there are things in there that are important. There's the Arthur Schlesinger memo that he wrote, or the report really calling for reorganization of the CIA that had been classified until just now. There's fuller versions of documents that have been released in the past. There's a lot that's new, and I think that there's a small number of people dedicated to reporting on what's going to come out about them. I hope that I can't really figure out what is going on with this, with Congress doing this in a Republican administration. I'm hoping it's that RFK Jr. kind of had a deal with Trump that this would happen, and so this is going forward. I'm potentially the state of the US breaking down as it is and US hegemony breaking down as it is. I argued in my dissertation that one of the ways you could really reform this is to reveal some spectacular crimes. You reveal the truth about things like JFK, hopefully maybe even 9/11 and Epstein and the anthrax attacks, some of these other scandals. I believe that it would be in the national interest to do so because this Imperial project has run its course, really. I don't believe that the US and the West can get back to the position that they were in at the beginning of the 21st century. And I think that if you are going to run an empire, you have to be a realist in terms of understanding fundamental facts of history. And I believe that the West, as the global dominator of humanity, that is not the case anymore. And it's a dangerous moment because of what the US, the empire might do to try to hold on to power. Would they do things that could spark a nuclear war or some other calamity that we wouldn't even see coming? I don't know, but I believe that the disclosure of scandals like this could be a good catalyst for reforms that really the oligarchy should be behind at this point because they need a society to live in that's not Mad Max world. Nobody really benefits from destroying civilization. And the US, with its war machine and nuclear arsenal, really has the potential to do that. And that is a threat to everybody. That's a threat to Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk. Nobody wants to live underground in some bunker for 50 years. It's insanity to even think you can escape that way. And I'm hoping that just cold hard realism will bring people to recognize that this could be a way to diffuse this, that you're going to have major reforms to our institutions, and that this might be a way to produce the consciousness to do that. Could be a unifying way to do it, because what we've had is a fascist regime that's so hideous that it can't see the light of day. It has to be denied and obscured with covert operations and crime syndicates and media that's owned by oligarchy and everything else. But it's that sort of rot at the top that is responsible for everything being so shitty, year after year and only getting worse. And I think more people are going to recognize that. And then how can you possibly change it? I think these sorts of revelations could be instrumental there. Alternatively, they could just be trying to tease us and have something else in the news cycle to distract from, all these other crimes. Who knows? You really normally don't go wrong by being cynical about what the US is up to. But I have a little bit of hope that what Winston Churchill said, which I'm not a fan of Winston Churchill, but he said, you can count on the Americans to do the right thing, but only after they've exhausted all other options. And I'm hoping that that might be the case for this oligarchy, which up to now has been pretty vicious and hell-bent on global dominance. But they failed there. And I think it's going to be harder for them to deny that. And maybe that's a sign of something hopeful.
Wow, thank you. And you mentioned Jefferson Morley. Before we wrap up, didn't he do those revelations about the Mossad, like students posing as students in the lead up before 9/11? Was that
No, I
him?
believe that was Chris Ketchum, maybe,
Okay.
who wrote an article at Counterpunch magazine about that, which was interesting that he wrote that because it was one of the few articles critical of Israel that are dealing with Israel that came out in the alternative media at the time. And then later it was weird because he kind of attacked Chris Hedges for plagiarism. And I'd always wonder, it kind of seemed like he was being put up to it by some Mossad people or something because it was such a strange hatchet job on him. I have some gripes about Hedges, but I like a lot of his work also. And it was
Yeah.
so strange that Chris Ketchum would go from writing this article that was pretty explosive about Israel and some connections to 9/11, and then suddenly attacking, one of the most prominent anti-Zionist people in the U.S. media. But yeah, I think it was Ketchum that wrote that.
Okay, all right. Well, either way, this has been a really great discussion, Aaron. I think you're doing really important work. I think you're following in the footsteps of, I mean, I know you've worked with Peter Dale Scott, but even people like Alfred McCoy. Yeah, I think you're doing really important work, and especially like addressing all this stuff from a left-wing perspective, which is really, I think, becoming a rarity these days. So I guess it's sort of inevitable we'd end up linking up and you seeing my article, inviting me on your podcast, and then coming on here because it really is a small community. There's not a lot of people writing about this stuff from this particular angle. And that gets into what we were talking about earlier and what Christian Perenni wrote about with this, even though the whole exposure of CIA crimes and the deep state is something that was a left-wing tradition for so many years, it's now become like this radioactive subject that no one can touch, and now it's purely associated with the right wing. So, yeah, it was great to have you on and to discuss this stuff. We're gonna put a link to your podcast, American Exception, and to your book as well. And you have a Substack too. We'll put a link to that. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on. Everybody can follow us on X. That's Captive Minds X. We have a YouTube channel to link to, and on Substack as well. Um, but Shaenah, do you have any final thoughts or anything?
No, just thank you, Aaron. It's been really great to have you.
My pleasure, and I support what you guys are doing here, and we need more people working in these areas because I think as things continue to decline, people are going to want better answers for how we got to be where we are, and we can be part of that project. So I salute you for that, and yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.